Welcome to the Earth Observing Laboratories seminar series. My name is Jørgen Jensen. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, EOL's Dr. Adriana Raudzens Bailey. Adriana has a bachelor's in environmental science from Brown University, a master's in geography from CU Boulder, and a PhD in atmospheric and oceanic sciences, also from CU Boulder. Adriana has worked for the Sierra Club and has been a science writer for CU. In addition, she has been a postdoc at GSAO at the University of Washington, and she has had a second postdoc at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. In 2018, she joined EOL as a Scientist 1, and since joining us, she has been involved in laboratory, ground-based, and airborne fieldwork. In addition, she is very familiar with modeling. Within EOL's research aviation facility, Adriana's research has focused both on wind measurement from aircraft and on measurements of water isotopes. It is the water isotope work that is the focus of today's seminar. Adriana is the lead PI for a NASA ROSES project on shallow convective mixing, precipitation processes, and their influences on low-level clouds. For the Eureka 4A project, she was a collaborator, but she really functioned in a PI role. Adriana has received a very large number of awards, and she is very involved in science organization and collaborations. Most recently, she has become co-chair of the US CLIVAR Working Group on Water Isotopes. In addition, Adriana is very active as a mentor, and recently she was made an If-Then ambassador for the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences. In this capacity, she serves as a role model for STEM careers for middle school girls. Today, we are using Slido to pose questions, which you can ask at any time during the seminar. The Slido window is located at the bottom of the presentation screen. Please do not be alarmed if you cannot see your question, because we are collecting all questions that will be revealed during the question and answer session at the end of the talk. Dr. Adriana Bailey, we welcome you, and the virtual stage is yours.
Well, thank you so much. Hopefully you can see me and hear me now. Yeah, we all know that tropical low-level clouds play a critical role in climate. As you can see from this NASA MODIS imagery on the right, these clouds are very effective at reflecting solar radiation back to space, much more so than the dark ocean surface below. These clouds are also effective pumps of moisture from the boundary layer up into the free troposphere, as indicated by this photograph on the left. And it turns out that these two roles are actually pretty tightly or closely related, or so some hypotheses go. So today I want to talk to you some more about this role of shallow clouds in transporting moisture up and out of the boundary layer into the lower free troposphere. And I'm going to do that in the context of Eureka, which was a major field experiment that took place in January and February of last year in the Western tropical Atlantic. I have a number of collaborators and colleagues that I want to acknowledge and thank. Some of them helped with data collection in the field. They include David Noon, Dean Henze, Leonie Villager, Franziska Amizager, and Mason Leandro, also the NOAA P3 flight crew. They were invaluable in their help. And then I'm also going to show some subsequent analyses that we've done looking at shallow convective mixing using satellite observations. And that work has been led by Jun Hu at Rice University, but also with support from Jesse Nussbaumer, Sylvia D, Christiana Sasser, and John Warden. So this work is sponsored both by the NSF and by NASA. So in 2014, Steve Sherwood and colleagues really highlighted the potential importance of these tropical low-level clouds in exporting or mixing, if you will, moisture out of the boundary layer and into the lower free troposphere. And they envision this mixing process as the small scale component of a sort of what you might envision as a lower tropospheric water cycle that's indicated here by these dashed lines. They also came up with a metric to try to measure the importance of this mixing or the strength of this mixing. And they called that metric S, which is defined in the box And it's basically an average of vertical gradients that are normalized, both in relative humidity, that's the H, and then in temperature, the T. Now, the big finding from their study was that GCMs, or general circulation models, that have stronger shallow convective mixing, this stronger moisture transport into the lower free troposphere, they tend to exhibit higher climate sensitivities, right? So that means that they get more warming for a doubling of CO2. And you can see that in this graph, which is showing the climate sensitivity on the y-axis, and then this S metric on the x-axis. And all of these different colored and shaped symbols, the ones, at least the ones with colors, are representing the GCMs. So not only is there this positive relationship between mixing and higher climate sensitivity, but also you can see that the mixing is explaining about 50% of the variance in the climate sensitivity spread. Now, to try to probe and I guess explain this relationship a little better, what Sherwood and colleagues showed is, for example, if you take a model that has more warming, as in the red lines here, and you compare it to a model with less warming, the blue lines, what you see is that the model with more warming has a moister lower free troposphere and also a relatively drier boundary layer. And if you enhance the surface warming, let's say by 4 Kelvin, you actually see that this relationship or this discrepancy is exacerbated. That's shown by the dashed lines. So the hypothesis that Sherwood and colleagues put forward is that when you have this more intense or greater shallow convective mixing, you're essentially moistening the free troposphere at the expense of the boundary layer. And then as you reduce the boundary layer relative humidity, you create conditions that are less favorable for future cloud development, and that allows more sunlight to reach and warm the surface. So you essentially have this positive cloud climate feedback. Now, interestingly, when we look at long-term or multi-year observations from ground-based stations in the tropics, like from the Barbados Cloud Observatory shown here, we get a fairly different picture of the relationship between shallow convective mixing and cloudiness. So I'll show you a little bit of work from Louise Nyens and colleagues. And here, what I'm showing you is the variability that they see at the Barbados Cloud Observatory. That's the BCO, which is shown by the very thick black lines in the 2 panels. And you're looking at the variability in cloud fraction, both at cloud base and aloft, as a function of timescales. And so the left-hand panel suggests that observations from the BCO tell us that cloud fraction at cloud base experiences about 50% of its variability on timescales of 1 day or faster. So in other words, these clouds are actually responding very quickly to any perturbations in the large scale environment and essentially keeping the cloud fraction at cloud base fairly invariant. You do get a different story when you look aloft, say at the height of the trade wind inversion. There you do see more variance happening at timescales, say of the synoptic scale or a bit longer. Now the real take home here though, is that when you look at what models are doing, the GCMs, which are all these colored lines, again, let's focus on the left-hand panel. When we look at the cloud fraction at cloud base, the models tend to think that the time response, sort of the variability in cloud fraction is happening at synoptic or longer scales. So they're not getting this very quick response to any large scale perturbations. And maybe what that suggests is that these models miss some sort of a buffering factor that's actually found in the real world. Now we can also look at how the BCO observations compare with models on longer timescales. So this is also work by Louise and colleagues, and it's showing basically differences from left to right in cloud fraction, relative humidity, and the virtual potential temperature between these different months. The darker black line is indicating the drier season, and the gray line, the wet season for Barbados. And what you'll notice is that even though the environmental conditions between the BCO and NCAR are fairly similar, meaning you look at RH and you look at theta V, and these differences between seasons are not too dissimilar between the observations and models, you have very different cloud responses. You don't see a very large difference between the dry and wet season and the observations, but you do see a fairly large difference in the model environment. And so that you don't think that I'm just cherry picking NCAR's Camp 5 for this example, let me also show you how the changes in cloud fraction between the dry and wet season for BCO, which is again the black line, compares to a variety of other GCMs, which are shown by these colored lines. And once again, we see that there's much less variance, so a pretty invariant cloud fraction in the observations compared to the model for these seasonal differences. So in essence, these different examples paint us two different pictures of how shallow convective mixing might relate to cloudiness. If you think about the Sherwood work, you might think that as you have more enhanced shallow convective mixing, you're exporting more moisture from the boundary layer, you're going to dry the boundary layer, you're going to end up reducing the cloud fraction, and that's going to have positive feedbacks on climate. On the other hand, if you look at observations from the Barbados Cloud Observatory, you might think that cloud fraction is fairly invariant on these longer timescales because there's a very quick response to perturbations. And that means that basically very quickly, the clouds will stop exporting moisture and they'll be able to maintain a moisture boundary layer and maintain their cloud fraction. So these two different pictures were a large part of the motivation behind Eureka, which is the elucidating the role of clouds, circulation, coupling, in climate field experiment. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this took place in January and February of last year, so just about a year ago. And it was located on the island of Barbados, in part because of the long-term cloud observatory that's stationed there. And also part of the reason why the cloud observatory is there is because the island protrudes quite far into the Western Atlantic. So it gives you really good access to many of the trade wind cumulus that you see in this photograph from the aircraft on the left-hand side. Now, Eureka not only brought together scientists from a whole variety of continents, Europe, the United States, the Caribbean, it also brought together a wide variety of in situ sampling platforms and remote sensing sampling platforms, both to look at the atmospheric conditions and also to look at the atmosphere ocean fluxes. Right here on this slide, I just have a few of the in situ platforms that were used on the atmosphere side. Starting on the left-hand side, you have one of the cloud kites that was flown off the ships. In the top center, you have one of the unmanned aerial vehicles that tended to sample profiles close to the island of Barbados. On the right-hand side, there's an image of radiosondes being launched from the Barbados Cloud Observatory. And finally, in the center bottom, there were several large aircraft as well. Now, with this large variety of platforms and also the large coordination that took place between the different science teams, we were able to cover quite a large area of what's known as Trade Wind Alley and the surrounding regions. To orient you a bit on this map, if you look down at the bottom left, there's sort of green shading, light green shading, which indicates the South American continent. And then as you move up towards the upper left, you'll see a much darker green, which is the island of Barbados. It's labeled BCO. Spanning out from that, you see this kind of swath that the radars were able to scan. And then you also see two aerial circles that the different aircraft flew around. And those aircraft included the German Hollow aircraft, the French ATR, the UK Twin Otter. And then in the circle that's more to the right, you see the NOAA P3, which I flew on. And then there were also a variety of ships, 4 major ships, as well as a number of autonomous vehicles. So it's really quite an impressive array of measurement types. Now in today's talk, I'm going to focus on measurements that I helped make on the NOAA P3. Also, Dean was really critical in helping make those measurements. And we're going to be looking at some vertical profiles, both to try to understand the moisture export from the boundary layer into the lower free troposphere, and then to try to understand under what conditions we see variations in that moisture export, whether there are relationships back to large scale factors that we can pinpoint or not. So I'll start by showing you a little overview of the different types of cloud conditions that we sampled, really to give you a sense of the variety of conditions that we experienced on our 11 flights. So starting in the left-hand side, these are all GOES imagery with the P3 flight tracks plotted on top in red that have been prepared by Mason Leandro from UC Santa Cruz. And in some of them, you'll see Barbados is marked by a star. In others, we're a little too far to the east to see the island. And then for reference, the hollow circle, which was the circle, the aerial circle closer to the island, is shown in some of these snapshots in yellow. So if we start on the left-hand side with flight 3, what you'll notice is that, there were clear cases of very active convection, all that white cloud, and then also very cloud-free areas where you see some of the flight track actually crossed into on that particular day. Moving over in flight 1, you have examples of sugary clouds or even gravel clouds that we sampled towards the northeast of this snapshot. Just to the right of that, you see during flight 5 that we also sampled sugar and gravel under the influence of Saharan dust. And finally, over on the far right, you see an example of flight 10, where we also saw more clustered clouds, which are sometimes called flower clouds. So let's start to get a sense of moisture export from these different cloud types and cloud conditions by looking at some of the level legs we flew and estimates of the vertical moisture flux, which are done in sort of a very traditional view or a very traditional approach of using aircraft data. So on the left-hand side, what I'm showing are moisture flux estimates from the P3, the NOAA aircraft standard hygrometer. And these are in grams per kilogram, meters per second. And just to the right of that, I'm showing similar estimates, but these are made with the NCAR fast water isotopic analyzer, which is also a hygrometer, which flew on the P3. And so you can see that there are moisture flux estimates for different altitudes here shown essentially focusing on the subcloud layer and then also the cloud layer itself, but not really going above the inversion for a variety of flights. So we had flights, for example, where dust was present, like flight 5, as I introduced in the previous slide. We also had conditions shown by these closed red circles where flower clouds were present. The open red circles are gravel clouds from the very same flight. And then finally, this light violet is showing us some of our most active convection that we sampled. And one thing that you'll take away pretty quickly upon seeing this is that there isn't a clear differentiation in terms of moisture flux from these different cloud types or different cloud conditions or atmospheric conditions. And the same is true even if we try to look at the moisture flux estimates from these level legs only at times when we're passing through updrafts, when the vertical wind is positive. So this raises the question that we'd like another way, maybe a different perspective, to think about moisture being exported or transported by clouds from the boundary layer into the free troposphere. So if this sort of bottom-up perspective isn't working, what about looking from the top down? And I think we can do that if we have the right kind of tracer, one that can help us distinguish very clearly moisture that's in the boundary layer from moisture that's already in the free troposphere. And this is where water isotope ratios enter this talk, as Jan alluded to. So we're going to use water isotopes as our way to distinguish the boundary layer and free tropospheric air and to get a sense of how much of that boundary layer air has been exported. Now, the trick to understanding water isotopes is sort of twofold. The first thing to realize is that different water molecules have either isotopically heavy hydrogen or isotopically heavy oxygen. And these isotopically heavier water molecules have a tendency to condense and then also rain out more effectively than their isotopically lighter counterparts. So if you look at a vertical profile of the water isotope ratio, which is shown here by the black line, and then the variance is shown around it as a gray envelope, what you'll notice is that the closer you are to the ocean surface, the lower altitudes, you'll have these higher isotope ratios. You'll see relatively enriched moisture. Whereas the farther away you get as you move into the free troposphere, you'll have these more negative isotope ratios, what we call more depleted moisture. And one thing to note also is that we use this delta notation because we express our isotope ratio, in this case, D to H, the heavy to light hydrogen isotope ratio, relative to an ocean water standard. So looking across a couple flights now, what you'll notice is that there's quite a bit of variability in these profiles. And yet at the same time, in each case, you can very clearly see differences between the boundary layer moisture and the free troposphere moisture in terms of its isotope ratio. And in particular, when you look at the far right with flight 10, you can even see that the isotope ratios begin to help us distinguish different free tropospheric air masses from one another, which would be very hard to do in the humidity profiles, which are shown in blue. The real power in using water isotopes, however, comes when you pair the water isotopic information with the water vapor amount. So this is a bit of an unusual plot, so I'm going to walk you through it pretty carefully. What you're looking at on the y-axis is the isotope ratio delta D, and it's plotted against the inverse of the volume mixing ratio. Essentially, that's 1 over the water vapor amount. Now, the red-orange line towards, one thing I should point out actually is that in this funny plot, the boundary layer plots in the top left and the free troposphere plots in the bottom right. So if you look up towards the boundary layer in the top left, you'll see this red-orange line, which is indicating the heights at which boundary layer moisture is exported or detrained from clouds. And this is really an effective height. That's something to keep in mind. Now, the light blue lines are showing mixing that is hypothesized to occur between these different detrainment heights, and then a free tropospheric end member that can be identified from the observations aloft. One other thing to point out is that the observations here are color-coded by their detrainment height. So this is one piece of information that we can gain from this type of plot of pairing the isotope ratio with the water vapor amount, is we can begin to see where water is being exported from the boundary layer. And a slightly different way of looking at this is just to create a histogram where here the bars are actually following the same color coding as the observations in the left panel. So flight 4 in this case really stood out, and you may notice that this was the case I previously called the active convection case, because it had a lot of detrainment at much higher altitudes, as high as 3 and 3.5 kilometers. And you'll notice how different that is when you begin to look at the detrainment height histograms from some of the other flights. And in this case, for some of these examples, I'm showing you data from the whole flight. And for those with an asterisk next to them, I'm showing you some select profiles that represent certain cases. Like for flight 8, I'm only showing profiles that represent flowers. For flight 3, I'm only showing profiles that represent developing convection. Now, there are some similarities between these. I'll point out a couple. You can notice that for both flight 4 and flight 7, we see some higher detrainment heights. And then for flights 5 and 11, we see more detrainment at these mid-levels of 1.5 to 2 kilometers. But as we delve a little deeper into these isotopic diagrams that I introduced on the last slide, we can actually start to really see some very important differences even among these pairs where the detrainment heights look somewhat similar, or the detrainment distributions look somewhat similar. So let's look, for example, at flights 4 and 7, which both show detrainment at higher altitudes. As you look at the isotopic diagram of the isotope ratio versus the inverse of the volume mixing ratio, you can really see some clear differences emerge. For example, with flight 4, which is our active convection case, you have the data points going all the way over to the detrainment line, the red-orange line. Whereas when you look at flight 7, you see a clear gap is forming. And that's an indication that this mixing that we're seeing, what we're seeing is more a remnant of mixing that occurred previously, rather than mixing that's actively occurring at this moment. And as compared to flight 4, where the convection is very active, in flight 7, what we're actually witnessing is some flowers and even fish clouds that are starting to break down into gravel and sugar. And we'll talk about flight 7 in a little more detail in a bit. Similarly, when we compare flights 5 and 11, we again see, despite the fact that both show quite a bit of detrainment at mid-levels, that we have sort of an active mixing case on the right-hand side with flight 11 and a not active mixing case on the left-hand side with flight 5. And that's not particularly surprising because with flight 5, we saw this large intrusion of Saharan dust. And so we would expect that to have a more stabilizing effect and to sort of shut down the active convective mixing in this region. So perhaps a little bit of a cautionary note or just something to keep in mind. The isotope ratios, when we when we look at these diagrams of the isotope ratio versus the volume mixing ratio, we have to be just a little bit careful in making sure that what we're looking at is currently active as opposed to something that's been recorded, meaning mixing or convection that's happened in the recent past. On the flip side, this type of memory in our tracer can actually be really powerful for trying to evaluate shallow convective mixing on these larger spatial scales and in this more bulk statistical way. So something to keep in mind. Now, what we've done so far is really just take a qualitative look at moisture export from these different cases. Let's take a more quantitative look by remembering that when we make these light blue lines, these mixing lines on this isotopic diagram, those are actual models, which means that where the data points fall along these lines actually indicates what fraction of boundary layer moisture is associated with that data point. And you can see that represented by these black contours that are now placed over the Flight 4 isotopic diagram. We also know the actual heights that all of these data points are observed at. And so putting this information together, the height information and the boundary layer fraction information, we can come up with these vertical profiles of a mean boundary layer fraction, which is shown here for Flight 4 in the black line. One thing to note is that the x-axis here says the minimum fraction of boundary layer water. And that's because when you get to, say, 0.8, I'm no longer trying to distinguish between 0.8 and 1 because it's extremely tight on that isotopic diagram. That's one limitation. And so this is just showing the minimum amount of boundary layer fraction that it possibly is. Now, integrating upwards from the top of the boundary layer to, in this case, I've done 4 kilometers, you can integrate this profile to get an estimate of the moisture export by shallow clouds during this particular flight. And I've done this in 2 different ways. The first way is that I've defined the boundary layer top by where theta E comes to a minimum. So that's shown in the gray line, and the actual top of the boundary layer, or I guess really where the trade-wind inversion starts, is indicated by this dashed red line. I've also created an integration up from about 700 meters to 4 kilometers, and 700 meters is our average LCL height for most of this campaign. And that's the number that you see that's actually in parentheses. But we're going to be focusing on the export number, which in this case is 16.7 kilograms per meter squared. Now, I was able to do this for most of the flights so far, but I will point out that there is some sensitivity in the result to your choice of the boundary layer height. Of course, it depends on where you define the minimum in theta E or if you use some other metric. But there's also the case where for certain flights, like Flight 3, which is shown now on the right-hand side, where there are actual differences between the different observations in where that minimum theta E actually occurs. And so you can see that by the 2 gray lines in the panel on the right. One is from the drop zones that we dropped from the P3, and the other is from the P3 temperature, the in situ temperature readings. And what you'll notice is there is a slight discrepancy between them. So that is one thing to keep in mind and a potential uncertainty in this analysis. But let's now look across all of the flights. So collectively, if we look at flights 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 10, and 11, we can see the different moisture export estimates, which are plotted on the y-axis, and I've plotted them versus the lower tropospheric stability metric on the x-axis. And of course, what stands out here are flights 4 and 3. Flight 4, of course, was that very active convection day, which I've talked about now a couple times. It was the day where we had detrainment occurring at various levels, including quite high at 3 kilometers in the atmosphere. And to illustrate that even better, you can see this photographic snapshot of Flight 4, where you can even see these very clear detrainment levels at different altitudes just by eye. Flight 3 is also a bit different, and this is actually the day before Flight 4, when that convection was just starting to develop for that very active case. And so you see greater moisture export on that day too. Remember that I did cherry pick the profiles where convection is actively developing for Flight 3. If instead I had looked at some cases where there was very little convective activity and in fact very cloud-free zones, we would have had a very different estimate of moisture export for this particular day. Now, in comparison to 4 and 3, most of the other flights show pretty similar levels of moisture export. In other words, it doesn't seem to matter if you're a gravel day or a sugar day or a flower day, the moisture export level is pretty similar. So this kind of raises two interesting questions. One is that we see large amounts of variability in moisture export between a very active convective day like 4, but then a day that has cloud-free zones like part of flight 3, we see very different export values. Whereas we don't see a lot of difference between some of the other cloud types that are kind of characteristic of this Barbados region. So can we start to think about what might be causing some of those differences in moisture export, and are they related back to large-scale environmental conditions? And I want to start with the question of the cloudy versus cloud-free conditions, which we'll use flight 3 as our example, and that's the snapshot here from GOES on the left. Recall that this particular flight started out by leaving Barbados in very cloudy conditions. That's where our developing convection profiles come from, but then went to the northeast where there was this large cloud-free zone. So we're going to look at some of the differences between those two areas. Now, zooming out for a minute, let's take a large-scale view here. And what you see if you look at 10-day back trajectories for Barbados for this particular flight, the particular day that the flight took place on, is that for mid-levels, say around 600 hectopascals, which are these yellower profiles or yellower trajectories, leaving Barbados, that most of these end up swooping to the northwest up towards Florida. And on the right-hand panel, you get an impression for why that's the case. These are upper air maps from the University of Wyoming that are from just a couple days prior to the flight 3. And what you'll see is that there's this subtropical jet streak, which is indicated by the arrows, that's helping the air circulate in this clockwise fashion back towards Barbados. So creating this large-scale northwesterly flow at mid-altitudes. But it turns out that this view is actually not granular enough for what we need, because as we zoom back in to the various profiles that we collected during flight 3, we can see some pretty stark differences between them. So here, what I'm showing from left to right is potential temperature, relative humidity, and then the zonal and meridional winds. And I'm showing these, they're color-coded in two ways. In the blue, you have the developing convection profiles, which have moisture export associated with them, quite significant moisture export. And then in gray, what you see are the profiles that come from places where you don't have developing convection. It's sort of on the edge of the clouds or in that cloud-free streak, that huge zone of cloud-free air that I showed in the GOES satellite snapshot. So when we look at these different environmental profiles, what you clearly see is that when you're in the cloud-free area, you have a much shallower boundary layer. That's what the relative humidity is indicating, and a drier boundary layer. And you also tend to have this more northwesterly flow, actually intruding all the way down to altitudes of 1.5 or 2 kilometers. So that's much lower than the back trajectories are indicating. And what you can see from this look too is that you get these discrepancies in where the northwesterly flow is affecting on quite small spatial scales, which we would never be able to pick out or not pick out as easily from the back trajectory and view of things. Now, when we look at the isotopic information, it helps confirm that in these cloud-free zones, which you see a picture of here on the right, that the air there really is consistent with this higher latitude intrusion. Because on the isotopic diagram, what you see circled is this very clear mixing line, but it's occurring at very low delta values. So these are delta values that are consistent with a much higher latitude air mass, indicating that this higher latitude intrusion is mixing down to levels where it can actually interact with the top of the boundary layer near Barbados. It's always nice to make sure that what you're showing is not a one-off example, but that some of your other cases also show something similar. And so that's what this slide is trying to show. So here's flight 9, where we also passed through a cloud-free zone, as you can see on the satellite imagery in the right. The red is showing one of the aerial circles that we did, and then the horizontal line are different profiles, sort of different legs that we flew at different altitudes zipping down into the boundary layer. On the left-hand side, what you're looking at is that same flight track plotted in gray, but here that horizontal stretch has been color-coded with the isotopic values that we observed. And what you'll notice is that as we pass to the right side of this circle into the cloud-free zone, those isotope ratios drop very significantly to values that we would expect with higher latitude air that's originating from higher latitudes. So perhaps for cloud versus cloud-free conditions, we have some connection back to the environmental large scale in terms of where the boundary layer may be interacting with a higher latitude intrusion. Let's now turn to the question of the different cloud types. And we're going to use Flight 8 for this example, because as you can see from the satellite snapshot, we started out the flight by sampling towards the south, where we got these nice flower clusters. But then later in the flight, we flew to the north of the circle, and actually entered some of the gravel cloud that you see labeled now. So remember that our moisture export values were not particularly different between gravel and flower clouds. So let's take a look and see if the environmental conditions and whether there are any differences might help us understand why. So again, we're going to look at vertical profiles from Flight 8, starting with potential temperature, then relative humidity, and the zonal and meridional winds. And these are, again, color-coded, but this time the gravel cloud area is shown in gray, and the flower cloud area is shown in blue. And what you'll notice is that the differences aren't huge, but there are some differences. For example, with the gravel clouds, we see a slightly weaker temperature inversion. We see slightly deeper boundary layers given by relative humidity. And then, at least in terms of the zonal winds, we see slightly larger backward shear. But then why are we not seeing very big differences in the moisture export between these two cases if we do see some differences in the environmental profiles? Well, let's see if we can't get a clue from Flight 7, which was actually taken the day before. And I'm going to show you a video of the flight track, but as tempting as it is to watch the plane fly around the little red line, I'm going to ask you to focus your attention instead on what's actually going on with the cloud fields. And we're going to start by looking at the eastern side of this image and see how flower clouds end up progressing to something different. So here we go. As the plane takes off, you can see on the eastern side of this snapshot that the clouds are a bit clustered, almost flowery, but very quickly they start to break down as they move to the west. But even the clouds now entering from the east are also starting to take on more of a gravel or even sugary appearance. And by the time we're wrapping up this flight, everything is looking very gravelly and sugary instead of flowery. So what this raises the question is it possible that gravel and sugar clouds are simply the temporal progression of what happens as flowers or fish tend to break down? So let's go back to Flight 8 and take a look at our isotopic diagram one more time, this time with the data color-coded by whether we're looking at the flowers or whether we're looking at the gravel clouds. And when we look at the flowers, which is the blue line or the blue dots, we can see a much more coherent mixing line, indicating a connection between the boundary layer, an active mixing of boundary layer air into the free troposphere by these flowery clouds. In contrast, when we look at the gravel clouds, we begin to see that coherent mixing structure really break down. And so that would be consistent with this idea that the gravel and sugar are showing the decay of the active mixing, the active convective mixing that the flower clouds bring about. So to summarize so far, we see greater moisture export is associated with very active convection near Barbados. And a prime example of that was for Flight 4, where we saw, as the histogram reminds us, detrainment of cloudy material at various heights, including much higher in the altitude. And that was also very evident in the photograph that I showed of this particular flight. It's also a flight, as you can see from the photograph, of very extensive cloud cover, and that was also confirmed by the satellite imagery that I showed earlier. And so that gives us a slightly different picture than what we might have imagined if we had just read the Sherwood et al. Paper, right? Instead of seeing active and strong shallow convective mixing drying the boundary layer and resulting in less cloudiness, we see very strong shallow convective mixing associated with strong moisture export and extensive cloud cover with detrainment at multiple cloud heights. Now, another cautionary note, right? We only have these handful of snapshots from our flights. And in this case, we don't have data on the P3 for several days following flight 4. So it's not entirely clear what may have happened later in this temporal progression. And that's something we're going to have to turn to other platforms or other tools to try to answer that question. Now, one other thing we learned is that there was quite a bit of difference in moisture export between the cloudy areas and the cloud-free areas, probably no surprise. But we were at least able to gain some insight into what caused some of these cloud-free areas. And they appear to be, at least in some cases, basically affected by these higher latitude air intrusions that had then mixed down to lower altitudes near Barbados. In contrast, we didn't see a lot of difference in moisture export from the boundary layer between different cloud types, such as between flower clouds and gravel clouds. And perhaps that's because these two types of clouds are part of the same progression or evolution, where what you're seeing during the gravel phase is actually the remnants of mixing from the flower phase in the isotopic data, which has that memory associated with it. Okay, so the last thing I want to turn to in this talk is a little bit of an extension of this work, because as great as field campaigns are for getting this very detailed view of the environment, they really only give us these snapshots in time where we have a limited number of days and also a limited area that we're able to cover. So this question of shallow convective mixing and its effects on both lower free tropospheric humidity and on cloudiness is really a question of global relevance, right? Because we're asking, how does this mixing affect cloud cover, which then affects feedbacks on the climate system that affect how much warming we get globally in terms of surface temperature for different greenhouse gas forcings. So one of the questions I've had in mind is whether we can use satellite observations to try to look at shallow convective mixing on these much wider scales across the tropics. And my thinking here has been that, well, when you have this greater shallow convective mixing, you can essentially erode the isotopic gradient or the isotopic lapse rate in the vertical. And so to give you a sense of how this works, if you look at the right-hand panel, on the y-axis, I'm again plotting the moisture export that I calculated through the isotopic diagrams that I showed you earlier. But now what I'm showing along the x-axis is this isotopic lapse rate, which you can think of as a difference in delta D between these two really chunky layers, one being 500 to 750 hectopascals and the other being 800 to 925 hectopascals. And these gradients were calculated by Christiana Sasser from University of Maryland. So one thing to note is remember that for flight 3, I've basically cherry-picked the profiles to look at active convection only. If instead I had looked at the cloud-free zones for case 3, we would actually see that there is a very sort of different linear relationship now in this plot, or more linear relationship in this plot. Christiana, when she did her gradients, put both the active convection in flight 3 and the cloud-free zones together. So that may be one flight that's a little bit of an exception here. The good news is that this isotopic gradient clearly does a good job of distinguishing the strongest shallow convective days from the weakest ones. And of course, you can see that because in both the moisture export estimates from Eureka and the isotopic gradient estimates, flight 4 really stands out for its very high values. So now what I'm going to show you are some snapshots of what this isotopic gradient looks like for different seasonal climatologies. And this is work that's been put together by Jun Hu. He's leading this study from Rice University. And I'm excited to show you some of his preliminary findings that he's preparing for publication. So these are his seasonal climatologies of the isotopic gradient from AIRS, which is a NASA instrument aboard the Aqua satellite. And what you can really tell is that where you get the strongest shallow convective mixing are the places where you generally have more active convection across the tropics. Now, to show you one more example of why this gradient works or why we think it works, here is June plotting the S metric from Sherwood, which was another way of trying to estimate the shallow convective mixing in the vertical. And if you flip back and forth between these a little bit, you'll see that there are actually some really nice similarities on these larger scales between the more active shallow convective mixing near the warm pool and across the ITCZ, and of course the S metric, then the higher S values that Sherwood et al. Would have come up with from their metric. Now, what's then the implication for cloudiness when we look at this from the satellite view? So here June has plotted changes in cloud fraction, changes in the shallowness of clouds, changes in surface temperature, and changes in the relative humidity of the free troposphere between periods where shallow convective mixing is stronger and weaker. And again, shallow convective mixing has been defined by this isotopic gradient from airs. And so what you see is that low-level cloud fraction, in fact, decreases over large parts of the tropics. The shallowness of the clouds also becomes larger, meaning the low-level clouds become shallower. And we see this moistening of the free troposphere through higher relative humidity. And all of that is associated with warmer sea surface temperatures. So this, in fact, is a lot more consistent with the Sherwood et al. Picture of the relationship between shallow convective mixing and cloudiness. Here, essentially, what we're seeing is that as warming increases and you have more intense shallow convective mixing, you get more of that moisture exported from the boundary layer into the free troposphere, moistening the lower free troposphere, and then ultimately resulting in a decrease in low cloud fraction over large parts of the tropics. So to finish up, I guess the lesson learned here is that when shallow convective mixing increases, we certainly do see this greater moisture export from the boundary layer into the free troposphere. But what it means for cloudiness, I think is still an open question, because we seem to get different answers depending on the data sets we're looking at. And those data sets represent very different timescales. When we look at the Eureka data that we took on the NOAA P3 aircraft, we don't see a reduction in cloudiness. In fact, we're seeing more cloudiness when shallow convective mixing is stronger. But when we look at the satellite results, we do see something a little more consistent with this picture of a reduction in low cloud fraction as shallow convective mixing increases. So there's still work to be done, including some model experiments at this point, but I've been very glad to at least show you some of these preliminary results, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Adriana, for a great talk. And we are almost ready to take questions here right now, but and please remember to add your name to to your questions and so on. I would like to ask one question first here myself, which is, in 2000, David Parsons was looking at mid-latitude dry air intrusions in the Western Pacific, and this was part of Toga Core and so on. And he hypothesized that these dry air intrusions would temporarily hinder convection, such that you kept pumping moisture out of the ocean, and you would end up building up a cape and eventually lead to much stronger convection. And you didn't really talk much about advection here, but do you think that the clouds and the patterns that you were looking at were affected by such mid-latitude dry air intrusions?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll start by saying, of course, a little caution, because we only have a few flight days. There were 11 total flights, and there are a few that I didn't look at because they were either limited in duration or because we didn't sample low enough in the atmosphere. So, we only have this limited number of samples so far. But yes, when I was at least looking at flights 3 and 9, those cloud-free zones really do seem to be associated with higher latitude air that has mixed into the Barbados environment, and in particular mixed downwards at altitudes that are not typical of most of the rest of the surroundings. So while you can think of it as sort of this large intrusion of air on a large scale, it's only reaching and sort of interacting with the boundary layer in select areas that we sampled. And that was something I didn't quite expect, but something that I think would be fascinating to look at in more detail. Like, why is it only in these streaks that it becomes important?
Yeah, because they were fairly small scale, it looked like your streaks.
Yes, for flight 3, it was obviously a lot bigger, but for flight 9, you could tell that we flew across it in a matter of 7 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's move to the first question here. And this is a question from Holger Föhmer. You showed satellite images which were classified as sugar, gravel, flour, etc. Other than looking differently on the satellite image, i.e. different horizontal distributions, do you have any information about the distribution of the cloud heights of these different types?
I don't off the top of my head. So these are rather new classifications that Bjorn Stevens and Sandrine Bonny have put out in the last couple of years. And they sort of were, something that we were all paying attention to as part of Eureka as a result. As far as I know, the original sort of classification was based more on horizontal distributions, but then Sandrine has followed up with a study this year that's looked at least what sort of environmental conditions these different clouds are found in. So there may be information about the cloud height distributions, and unfortunately I just don't have that at the tip of my fingers right now. So maybe that's something I can follow up with you about later, Holger.
Okay, thank you. And next question from Andrew Gettleman. Adriana, great presentation. Why does enhancing moisture flux result in reducing the cloud cover? Wouldn't it moisten the planetary boundary layer or free troposphere above and encourage cloudiness?
Yeah, thanks for this question. I think this is where so much of this debate lies, right? Is, you look at certain climate models, and now I'm thinking about some of the work by Bryant et al., 2016. Certain climate models, what you see is an increase in this shallow convective transport, and that ends up being balanced in a mass balance sort of way with entrainment from above. And so that grows the boundary layer and ends up drying it. And it's sort of through that entrainment process, sort of the downward flux, that you end up bringing this very dry air in, which then reduces the relative humidity enough to affect cloud cover. On the other hand, there's some GCMs where instead of, as you increase the shallow convective flux, you can also increase the surface moistening flux. And so you end up not deepening the boundary layer in the same way, but rather creating a sort of moisture enhancement or accumulation, as you're suggesting, within the boundary layer itself, which can then help feed the clouds. So a lot of this has been sort of motivated by the way different different GCM parameterizations of shallow convection, how they operate, and trying to figure out which one might be the more realistic representation of the real world. Then there's always the possibility that when you look at the real world, it'll be something completely different. And that's kind of what Eureka is setting out to, at least one of the things it's setting out to study.
Okay, thank you. Next question. And this is from Jeff Stith. Nice job, couple of questions. Was there any precipitation in the clouds? And what did you do to avoid, especially in the larger clouds? And secondly, are you or anyone else using conserved variables, total mixing ratio, ozone to do mixing analysis to support your isotopic study? And thank you.
Yeah, thanks for these questions, Jeff. There was some precipitation, partly, we saw it is one, but secondly, you could actually see that a little bit in the isotopic diagrams too. With this more effective rainout, one of the things that the orange-red line shows, the sort of effective detrainment height line, is it's essentially giving you a sense of how effectively the system is raining out water back into the boundary layer. It will be really interesting, but as far as I know, the microphysical data has not yet been produced for the P3, but I think that's where a lot of the really interesting analysis of precipitation is going to come into place, at least for the NOAA data set. And basically that will give us not only droplet size distributions, but also liquid water content, which we would need for something like the total mixing ratio, the total water mixing ratio. So what did we do to avoid precipitation? I mean, we didn't really need to. We certainly didn't go through any major precipitation events. It was all much more light precipitation. And I guess, a question that I'm certainly excited for folks to look at, and is kind of underway now by one of the ASP postdocs, Mampi Sarkar, is looking at how re-evaporation might be affecting the environmental conditions for some of these flights that we looked at. As far as looking at other conserved variables, we at least currently don't have the total mixing ratio. We don't have it for at least the beginning flights, and we also don't have ozone. My sense is I've looked at some of these quantities in other places like Hawaii, and to be really honest, the isotope ratios do a better job. They're not conserved in the same sense, but then neither are things like ozone, which gets affected by photochemical processes. And so with all of these tracers, you have to be a little bit aware of sort of what the sinks and sources are. And the nice thing about the isotope ratios is in these diagrams I show you, we can pretty clearly distinguish what's changing because of precipitation and what's changing because of a mixing process. So hopefully that answers your questions.
Okay, thank you. And the next question from Maya. Hello, Adriana. Are both cloud types composed of just water molecules, or are there ice crystals involved? And thank you again for the presentation.
Yeah, thanks. These are both low-level, these are all low-level clouds that I'm discussing. So these are all warm clouds made up of droplets instead of ice. If you may have gathered from some of the detrainment height diagrams that I was showing that a lot of these clouds are forming at 700 meters roughly, and then detraining as low as 1-2 kilometers. Flight 4 was really an exception with some of these clouds detraining up around 3.5 kilometers.
Okay, good. And do we have more questions? Not right now. You're welcome to come with more questions. And of course, you can also contact Adriana in person afterwards. Should we just give somebody 30 seconds to come up with a real cracker question? And lacking that, I think we should say thank you very much again for a great presentation, Adriana.
Thank you.
You a virtual applause. So you have a thank you so much. Bye-bye.